In my 6 years as a Shopify certified marketing and setup expert, I have consistently had to answer questions related to bounce rates for e-commerce stores. What is a good bounce rate? Is my bounce rate too high? And what we can do about it. So first of all, let's define the bounce rate, because most people actually are a little bit confused about that and often confuse it with exit rate. So bounce rate is simply a user coming to a page and then the amount of people that leave without either triggering an action that is tracked on Google Analytics or viewing another page. So Google Analytics naturally tracks all the page views, but if you don't have any events that are configured to affect the bounce rates, then you can actually have a person be very engaged with the page while still showing up as a bounce. So that's a quick rundown on what a bounce rate is. And then a natural follow-up question from here is, should I have a dedicated effort to lowering my bounce rate? Is this high bounce rate a problem? Well, the answer is it depends. So it depends on many, many different things. So one of them is your industry. What should your bounce rate be? What is actually considered a problematic bounce rate? So are you actually tackling a problem here that is a problem, or are you just trying to already optimize a metric that is actually pretty good for you? So here, that's something to understand, but also understanding your structure. So for example, I've seen many e-commerce stores that complain that their bounce rate is high. However, they're still getting a lot of email opt-ins from the page, and they are not configured to record those email opt-ins on Google Analytics. So it actually looks like people are just leaving while they're really engaged, viewing the page for 15 minutes, subscribing to the email flow, etc. So this really depends on your page. So for example, I'll show you a page where the bounce rate being high is not actually a problem. So here's our lead generation page, basically our front page on the site that we run, crogurus.com, which, by the way, if you haven't yet checked it out, you should. We provide CRO consulting services and help e-commerce stores get to their next level. Anyway, so here we have a lot of information here, and this can be time consuming. And here you'd expect a higher bounce rate just because there's nothing else to do here except apply in the end. So if you have these kind of pages on your store, you can definitely expect a higher bounce rate. So bounce rate itself is not necessarily a great performance metric. It's more of an indicator of which percentage of people are leaving or being disinterested. However, that also requires a little bit of configuration. So for example, we have a video here, and if you don't configure this properly, you will actually have a bounce even though they will view the entire video. So that's something to consider as well. And this is why you can't just blindly trust the bounce rate as a metric. So you can have a very engaged person and still have them bounce. All right, so let's look at different ways to then lower that bounce rate, because there is a good case for lowering the bounce rate. If you think of it in terms of this, like say your bounce rate would be 80%. If you can cut that to 60%, you would then have twice the actual visitors to your store, and you'd, of course, do pretty well compared to the previous scenario. So before we look into different ways to lower your e-commerce bounce rate, let's first check how to measure it. So I'm here on our site, crogurus.com, Google Analytics. If you select the behavior, go to site content, all pages, you will then be able to see your bounce rate. One thing I recommend here is that you only are concerned about your pages that have a certain number of visitors. So here you can just go and use the page view filter. So if you click on this advanced thing, include page views more than whatever your traffic is like. But definitely use a metric that matters. Here, it of course also depends on how much traffic you are getting. So here I filtered some of the less common pages out of it with this. So now only the more popular pages are showing. And here we can then see the different bounce rates on this one. For an e-commerce store, I recommend looking at it page types. So for example, your product pages, you can filter them as well. So you can have an additional one here. So page contains, say, products in Shopify. You'll get the product pages. And that way, you'll be able to see which ones are performing better and which ones are not. So you can work on that. So there, you can also get a little bit of a context of what generally is a good bounce rate for you. And you can also look into these pages by clicking here to get a better idea of which pages are the kind of pages that should have a lower bounce rate. So if they are more like, okay, there's a bunch of links, you'd want, of course, a very low bounce rate. If there are cases where it's a lot of text, maybe there's an email opt-in, etc. that is not tracked, then high bounce rate is typically all right. Then once you have done those changes, you can use the comparison one here to compare your previous period so that you'll be smarter about that. All right, now that we understand what the bounce rate is and how to measure it, we can look into what to actually do to lower your bounce rate. I'm going to share 5 tips here that you can use and implement right away to improve your bounce rates. Now, first and the biggest one by far is the page speed. And many people are not aware of their page speed being a little bit bad because they might be on a fast office computer and they already have half their site cached and downloaded to their browser. So in the first time visitor case, this is not true, and they will be way more likely to bounce because for them the experience is slower. So here is data from Google where they say that the probability of bounce increases 32% as page load times goes from 1 second to 3 seconds. Now, I rarely see e-commerce stores loading in 1 second. However, it is something where, say, like you take it from 8 seconds to 4 seconds, you would have a massive impact. So there, usually most stores actually have more potential than this. And here's some related data. Feel free to pause the video if you want to look into this one as well. It's all from Google, so should be somewhat accurate data. They didn't just pull it out randomly. There's also like some supporting here, so you can see like impact of page load time increased by 1 second. So from this data, also coming from Google, is you have from 1 second to 3 seconds, 32%, from 1 to 5, 90%, and these kinds of things. So it is very impactful. It's the easiest thing you can do. Couple more examples here. So here's like how many visitors leave if your site is slow to load. I think you're going to get it by this point. And you can measure this actually with different tools. I prefer the tool called GT Metrics, where here is actually our old site. So you can see like basically nothing happens for a very long time. And then you get this. So a bounce rate on this kind of site will be a lot higher than the bounce rate on this kind of site, where you actually see that things are happening in less than a second and everything's loading instantly. So it's a lot more usable, of course, in this situation. So next up, analyzing your traffic acquisition. So are you actually attracting the kind of people to the site that want to browse your site? So for example, if you are attracting some people that are not on your target audience, they're way more likely to bounce. If you are not talking to them in a way that like takes care of their niche, takes their niche into account. So if, for example, you have a very female-oriented store, but you are not guiding only females to the store, then it's probably going to be an impacted thing. Also, one thing I see constantly is that you have like just a very low quality banner traffic coming to the site, and it's like basically spray and pray. You just try to get like as cheap of visitors as possible, and then like you have a ridiculous bounce rate, and then people wonder why people didn't convert. But those weren't qualified traffic in the first place. All right, next one. So this is just a simple thing. Like think of your first experience on the site. So if you have something like this, where there's like 5 widgets here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, actually like, yeah. So it's going to be quite a task to close these ones. And here it's a one where you're just shooting yourself in the foot with this. Like imagine loading a site and like suddenly you are prompted with all kinds of things before you can even know what this site is about. So it just comes off quite salesy, and it's not inviting the visitor to browse. So think of like how often and how quickly do the website pop-ups, because these can be annoying when it happens so soon that you basically don't have any idea what's on the page. And then you can configure this from the settings in a way that doesn't disrupt the experience. Point number 4, having a clear navigation menu. So if your website visitors cannot understand where and how to use this, then it's going to be high bounce rate probability. So here's an example of an unconventional navigation where it can be a little bit troublesome to use a site like this. So they do have their burger menu. It's not outlined that it's a menu, but then like you have this interactive element. So this is not what we'd call a prototypical setup, where people would know how to use this from experience. And it's tempting to sometimes design a site to be so clever with complex elements, but often the result is just that it ends up being overwhelming to the end user. So whenever you encounter this kind of unfamiliar setup, then consider whether you'd want to simplify it a little bit. And perhaps you can add a traditional navigation menu that is open by default on desktop to complement this menu here if you must have it. So because otherwise it's going to be difficult to navigate on this and to understand where you are, etc. So here you just end up going in some path and no idea how to get back. Maybe this goes to the front page. Okay, this goes to the previous page. So it's like a little bit of a confusing thing. Of course, in your e-commerce store, you probably have something a little bit simpler, but this is an example of how you can still complicate things if you really aim for it. All right, so next up is making the site contents easily scannable. So you can have an impression that is clear. So here, we have a clear navigation menu. We have a clear banner, and it's easy to understand what's here. So here, in this way, you guide the visitor to the next thing quite efficiently, and they don't have to get confused or stuck. Now that's the visual part of it. There is also a copywriting part of this that really makes a big difference. Now imagine you go to a store and you're probably doing that after work or in between things. So you are not 100% necessarily focused on that. You don't want to read an academic paper. Your energy levels are probably a little bit low because you're going to shopping anyway. You're not fair, fight and conquer mode. So here you'd want to serve them an experience that is an easy to use experience. You'd want to even take the Homer Simpsons of the world in a way that they understand how to use the site. So one good tool for that is WebFX. They have this readability tool called Readable. And you can just fill your site here. So for example, here's our site where it then shows which level of readability this would be. So this would be understood by 13 to 14-year-olds. And this way you can judge whether your site should be simpler or more complicated. Here, I think this is still very much a complicated site, but it is meant to serve a smart audience. So in a way, this is still all right. We typically aim for that third grade level. So third grade would be 9 to 10-year-olds on that one. So generally, if this was a customer site, we would be simplifying the copy. When it comes to copy and texts in general, the easiest way to improve it is to just make sure that you don't have much complexity there. So if you have complex words or long sentences, complicated sentences, you can then simplify it and use more common words, simple sentences, shorter sentences, and make it a little bit punchier that way. This way, it's a lot easier for people to read longer. And the longer they read, typically, the more convinced that they will be. So here's a quick example of this, where we have these principles in play. So first of all, clear headlines, clear call to actions, clear body text, and it's combined with clear sectioning. So you have clear sections outlined here with the background color, and you know which section means what. So basically there's no sections without headlines, for example. And this way, it is easy to understand even on a mobile device where you are, and you're not going to get lost even on a longer page. So this will definitely help your conversions as well. So that's that. Thank you very much for watching this video. If you haven't already, subscribe to the channel and like the video, because you obviously got this far, so you must have got a lot of value out of it. Thank you very much, and see you on the next videos. Cheers.